So, the mask of Israel has basically been slipping off of its demonic face for the past 8 or so months. And recently, a story came out about the ICC and the clandestine war that Israel has been waging against it in order for Israel to avoid being brought to justice for war crimes as well as crimes against humanity. Now, I wanted to walk through a timeline after having read all of the stories on this and help you understand exactly what it is that the Israelis have been doing throughout this entire period. Now, we could start the story off somewhere back in the 1890s or even earlier than that, but we're not going to go that far back for now. We're going to start in 2014. Now, the Palestinians have been screwed by nearly everyone for decades, and in 2014, President of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, petitioned the United Nations to recognize a Palestinian state and to put a time limit on the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. Irrespective of the image that Israel projects out into the world and the plausible deniability that it disseminates in its Hasbara, and don't worry, you'll become familiar with that term as you get to know Israel, we, the land of the free and home of the brave, decided to help Israel by putting pressure on a bunch of the voting countries to either abstain or to vote no. And I mean, this was a complete and utter farce. And I'm not sure how this witch, Samantha Powers, who cast her no vote, said the following with a straight face, but she claimed that it's not because we're comfortable with the status quo, it's that peace comes from hard compromises. And personally, I'm not entirely sure what a Palestinian can compromise on more. But hey, if we're helping God's chosen people, a little bit of apartheid is just par for the course, I guess, when you're an American. Now, if you've studied political science, you know that there are two ways to gain statehood. One of the ways is by being recognized by other states, and the other way is by entering into agreements with other states and international agreements. Now, Abbas was hell-bent on managing to get a state, and he also had a bonus here. Because in 2009, Abbas had asked the prosecutor's office at the ICC to investigate alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Israel against Palestine. But because Palestine wasn't a signatory to the Rome Statute, nor was Israel, they couldn't do diddly squat. So, in 2014, he does sign the Rome Statute and requests that the ICC recognizes the state of Palestine. Now, a lot of Palestinians began seeing a tiny damn light at the end of the long-ass tunnel that they've been walking through. And they stated that they were going to start moving real fast here. Now, this presented a problem for Netanyahu because if Palestine is recognized by the ICC, irrespective of if Israel recognizes the ICC's jurisdiction or not, it will still be subject to the court's jurisdiction if its victims are covered by the Rome Statute. So, Netanyahu called it, and get this, diplomatic terrorism and one of the most aggressive things that the PA has ever done to Israel. Now, you will come to find that Israelis are glass cannons because they can dish out a lot of punishment, but they can't take much. Considering what they've been doing to the Palestinians for nearly a century, you'd really think submitting themselves to the ICC wouldn't exactly be considered that aggressive, right? So you might ask, how come? Well, here's the thing. If Israel had an accurate national slogan, it would be, "We enjoy impunity." So the fear of the ICC actually harmed Israel's ability to place officers in the West Bank. Now, you might or might not know this, but Israel kind of uses Gaza and the West Bank to develop and test weapons, as well as crowd control tactics and surveillance technologies. Now, we can't have our guys worrying about being punished for their war crimes while they're fueling our economy by testing out weapons and tactics that we sell, right? So, the ICC accepts a Palestinian state. And in 2015, Netanyahu scrambles to assemble a cross-agency task force to handle the situation, and they move damn fast. Within about a month, then chief prosecutor of the ICC gets a visit from two guys who hand her an envelope with a few $100 and an Israeli phone number. The message implicitly was pretty clear: we know where you live. Also, the ICC personnel were blocked from visiting the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, I mentioned that Israel's national slogan would be impunity, right? Well, spying on an ICC prosecutor should be a pretty big deal, but apparently because she was black and African, they just went, meh, she's barely human anyways. Now, you gotta hand it to them because most people would at least try to hide their racism, but I digress. Now, because the ICC was blocked from visiting the OPTs, they had to conduct their investigation over phone from Palestinians. Well, in comes the Shin Bet, installing Pegasus on NGO workers' phones. And yep, that's the same spyware that the Saudis used to track and capture and butcher the journalist Khashoggi. Israel sells this spyware for a number of millions per contract per year. It was actually pretty impressive how quickly that the Israelis got this thing up and running off the ground, almost like they'd done this stuff before. The IDF, the Shin Bet, the Mossad, and both the civil and military justice systems collaborated because remember, one of the most obvious clues that Israel operates an apartheid system is that Palestinians on the West Bank live under military law. And all of these organizations reported into the National Security Council, which worked right beneath Netanyahu. And you can tell that the entire operation was designed to flip the ICC into an allied organization, and failing that, to postpone or forestall any investigations by spreading uncertainty and doubt about jurisdictions and about the case's validity and merit. So, the intelligence units would feed their findings back to the lawyers, who would then prepare counterintelligence to be fed back into the ICC through any of the assets that they managed to flip in Bensouda's vicinity. You know, get her surrounded by doubt. It's a pretty good tactic. The most evil and vile thing here was that the surveillance was meant to be fed back to the lawyers also. Oh, actually, because this is worth mentioning, is the term complementarity. So the ICC is basically a court for Africans and thugs, and that's what Karim Khan himself said that he had been advised by some elected official. Now, personally, I'm going to go ahead and guess that that might have been Lindsey Graham. This court is not supposed to be used on Western democracies. It's basically a cudgel that we use to beat other countries over the head while we pretend to be civilized in our suits and ties while we reaper drone their asses. So, if you have a Western democratic legal system, which Israel pretends to have, the ICC doesn't need to get triggered, because as long as you have laws on the books to punish whatever the ICC usually investigates, and every now and again you do press charges, you can commit all sorts of atrocities without anyone ever getting punished for it, and you never get taken to the ICC. So basically, what would happen here is that the surveillance folks would feed back what the ICC was investigating, and the Israelis would pretend to open investigations on their own end to claim that the ICC didn't need to come into play because of complementarity. It's pretty darn sneaky if you ask me. In 2016, we don't have much concrete evidence to go on, but when you run an operation like this, you gotta figure that it's going to take at least a year to begin getting close to and working on assets, at least if you're going to make it look natural, right? So I'm going to guess whiteboards, pictures, names, because I mean, you got to start mapping out your people, you got to start tracking their habits, you got to find out about their likes and dislikes, their ideological bents and values, and if they have any vices that you can exploit. That's why this profession is called a craft. It's both an art as well as a science, and only practice makes you better at it. Or at least, so I thought. And by 2017, the Israelis had begun making some significant progress. They've gotten close enough to the right people to set up a secret back channel. Now, this is pretty unusual as well, because imagine if you were suspected for crimes and you got to have secret meetings with the prosecutor to go over the charges and explain stuff from your side of the table. Anyways, the Israelis pulled out all the damn stops here. They got their top diplomats, top lawyers, top ministers, and military and civilian law experts, and they began doing the job. And that job was to sow enough doubt for Bensouda, the prosecutor, to not open a full investigation into potential war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also to present the bogus cases that they had supposedly opened. Now, in 2017, that's also the year when Netanyahu deploys the big guns, Yossi Cohen, a career spy and close confidant, to personally oversee the operation. Cohen first approached the prosecutor in 2017, and I gotta say, the man doesn't seem particularly good at his job. I guess it's easier to flip Palestinians who are under occupation and without rights than flipping a woman at the top of her profession. Now, this continues through 2018, with the Israelis thinking that they're making some good progress. They continue running their influence campaigns and try to open up fake cases to prove complementarity. But this is also when we begin seeing other assets come into play. Alright, so in 2018, Cohen ambushed the ICC prosecutor in a hotel suite in New York. The hotel suite belonged to one Mr. Kabila, the then president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC for short. The ICC prosecutor and Kabila were having a meeting in New York to go over cases that the DRC was involved in. But apparently, Cohen had managed to convince Mr. Kabila to let him ambush the ICC prosecutor. Seems like this little stunt caused some major concerns among her staff, and it doesn't seem to have been executed with any particular degree of elegance. Now, why would the president of the DRC be helping the Israelis, though? Fun fact, did you know that Israel arms most genocides and hellish conflicts on earth? And they have a track record of arming the side doing the atrocities? No? Well, Israeli arms sales to the African continent have been on a massive growth trajectory over the past few years. From the Sudan to Rwanda, mid-genocide, these guys knew what was going on and still kept arming the Hutus, and to give themselves some political cover, they sent a medical team to help the few surviving Tutsis get some aid. Now that medical team right there is what we call fuel for useful idiots. So just enough doubtful material to give your paid-for politicians and Jordan B. Peterson fans enough of a lifeline for cognitive dissonance not to make their damn heads explode. In fact, the Israelis even helped apartheid South Africa keep up its apartheid system, just in case you were wondering why the South Africans have sympathy for the Palestinian cause. Now then, I told you that Bensouda was a tough cookie. Despite the massive pressure and threats that she'd been under, in 2019 she concludes that she does indeed have a reasonable basis to proceed with her case to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, either Bensouda really wanted the Palestinians to see some justice and for the case to be ironclad, or the Israeli operation had actually worked to some degree. Either way, instead of proceeding on her own, she submitted her case to the pre-trial chamber for a decision on whether she had the jurisdiction to continue or not. Of course, the 2017 back channel seizes right here, and Mr. Cohen starts getting really desperate. I'm pretty sure he had quite a bit of pressure coming from Netanyahu, maybe even a big monetary bonus if he succeeded, but he ratchets up the threats. Now, it's in 2019 that the Congolese president who helped Cohen ambush the ICC prosecutor finally gets paid off. It seems that part of the deal was likely a preferential rate on private military services by the Israelis to conduct surveillance and intercepts and intimidation tactics against his political opponents. And just after October 7, 2023, Israel repatriated most of its trainers and staff in the Congo. Now, mind you, these trainers are there training the people who are doing the starving and the murdering of internally displaced populations, as well as disappearing unwanteds. I wonder where they picked up that type of skill set. Now, alright, so the case is going to proceed, and the Israelis don't seem to be moving forward on their own. And just as they always seem to do when they're in trouble, they come crying to Big Papa USA to bail their asses out. Trump was happy to work with the Israelis because, remember, he picked Mike Pence as his VP, mainly as a bid to win the support of the evangelical crowd in the US. Yep, exactly. The crazy-ass people who want the Jews to return to their homeland so that the Messiah can return. Isn't it ironic that the evangelicals of the United States are undermining their own agenda by doing what AIPAC wants them to do? See, the Palestinians are the rightful descendants of the ancient Hebrews. They're the ones who stayed and refused to leave the land, and they're the tribes of Israel, God's original chosen people. Now, if the evangelical wanted the Jews to return to Jerusalem, their homeland, they should be fighting for the right of the Palestinians and ejecting the European Jews who come from Khazaria. Anyways, I digress. So Trump needed to keep his evangelical crowd happy. Unlike Obama, the Trump administration was very happy to work with the Netanyahu government to share intelligence and collaborate on pressuring the ICC. And so the US helped by adding Israel's case to the sanctions that the US was already putting on the ICC for investigating the crimes of US service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because, we can't have our boys held responsible for behaving like savages, can we? We're the good guys, right? Well, let's just say that there's a lot invested in upholding that myth. And they begin trying to deploy the most typical tactics used when you're going after somebody. Just undermine their credibility. An ICC judge you don't like? Obviously she has to be corrupt and malfeasant. Or a DA who wants to press charges for your financial crimes? That has to be a Soros-backed DA, obviously. Now, being backed by Big Daddy USA, Cohen seems to have been getting real brave. Not entirely sure, but I think this is when the most blatant threats started coming out of him, including showing the prosecutor pictures of her family members and telling her that she should really consider their safety. Now, 2021 comes around, and after a year of deliberating, the pretrial chamber concludes that Bensouda and the ICC do in fact have jurisdiction to proceed with the case. The case she had proposed focused on three things. 1. The IDF war crimes during the 2014 Operation Protective Edge, where even a Jewish pro-Israeli Zionist found that the IDF had engaged in massive war crimes during an investigation. I'm guessing you haven't read it, but I suggest that you give the Goldstone report a read. Look, there's plenty of satanic conduct befitting a demon outlined in that report, but especially one story basically proving that Hamas doesn't use human shields, and that they'd rather sacrifice themselves than put their civilians in undue harm. Meanwhile, the Israelis and the IDF leveraged the civilians of Gaza against Hamas by using them as human shields and bargaining chips. The second thing was the Great March of Return in 2018. If you've ever heard a useful idiot suggest to you that the Palestinians should have tried peaceful means, here's evidence that the Israelis can't be reasoned with. Palestinians in Gaza held weekly peaceful civil protests where all the Palestinians did was walk towards the perimeter of their concentration camp, and for their trouble, they were used for target practice, with a few thousand Palestinian casualties being the result. Snipers had even fired at children, medics, and journalists. I think one of the guys was even in a wheelchair. If that wasn't bad enough, medics also thought that the Israelis were testing experimental munitions because the wounds they were seeing were pretty unusual. Fits the Israeli modus operandi, though. It's strange, really. The Israelis keep up a very good reputation. It tells you a little bit about how easily fooled people are and how much marketing actually matters. Now, if you have any doubt whatsoever about Israelis being pure evil, there's plenty of videos of them sniping unarmed Palestinian children and celebrating the results.
אוי, זה סרטון! יש!
And finally, number 3, settler violence. There's a few hundred, if not thousands, of examples of the illegal settlers stealing Palestinian homes, harassing Palestinians, or even killing them while the IDF just stands there and watches. It makes it a de facto policy on the ground, irrespective of whether it's a policy passed by law or not. All you do is you take your most extremist settlers and you put them in the IDF and you have them be the responders to dispute cases out in the field, and the magic will just take care of itself. But unfortunately, Bensouda's tenure was coming to an end, and with that, it would be up to the next prosecutor to decide what to do with the case. So then comes the appointment of the next ICC prosecutor. Of the options, Israel pulled the lucky straw, because the ICC prosecutor could have been an Irishman, and the Irish do have their own history with being brutalized by colonizers. Now, Spain has also been pretty sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. However, the UK, where Karim Khan comes from, it doesn't matter if you go Tory or Labour, everybody is a bought and paid for Zionist. On top of that, Khan's reputation says that he's a conservative and that he's risk averse. He wouldn't want to ruffle any feathers if he didn't absolutely have to. And much like was expected and prayed for by the Israelis, by 2022, Khan did shelf the case, partly because of the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. 2022 is an interesting year because the journalists started getting a whiff of something being up. Now, one journalist, Gur Megiddo, so I really wish this guy would have kept at it because, Armageddon is made up of two words, Har Megiddo, Hill of Megiddo. It would have been awesome if a dude named for the hill of the end time battle would have brought down hellfire on the Netanyahu government, but he didn't, and who can blame him? He was working on a piece about the Israeli-Congo weapon pipeline, and had heard rumors about the Kabila hotel situation in New York back in 2018. So he placed a call to the ICC prosecutor's office, and his call was intercepted. Because remember, they were tapping the phone lines. The Mossad called him in for a meeting and promptly assured him that if he published his story, he'd see the inside of a Mossad interrogation cell. Same thing goes if he handed his story over to an international colleague. Now, you ever heard anyone repeat the propaganda motto that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East? Have you ever heard of a democracy in a country without a free press? See, Israel has had censorship control over its press since the country's foundation back in 1948, so anything that's a security matter can get censored. It basically means that only the stories and the wordings that the IDF want to come out comes out, because basically everything is a security matter in Israel. It's also why Israel controls and surveils all communications in and out of the OPTs. In 2023, Khan is kind of forced to open the case. And I'm betting money he probably would have wished he didn't have to. But he was simply put in a position where he inherited a crab sandwich. And Netanyahu and his religious nutbags just kept flagrantly using genocidal rhetoric that Khan's legacy would have been tarnished by if he didn't take action. As soon as he began looking at the case again, the surveillance machine got up and running as well. Probably one of the insiders that Israel cultivated before gave them a heads up. Apparently this time, it started on a desperate end with threats right off of the starting block. Unfortunately for them, the ICC seems to have hired a semi-competent security manager who brought the ICC's security up to par, so it wasn't as easy to conduct surveillance as it was during the Bensouda tenure. I'm pretty sure that Khan would have gladly allowed the Israelis to conduct their genocide, but here's the thing. People have a hard time looking at a famine, especially when they know that it's man-made. And that's why Khan was specifically telling the Israelis what to do to avoid being subject to a case at the ICC. Now, on a side note, Israelis keep bragging about their high IQs. If you've ever argued with an Israeli about the fact that a thief can never become an owner, at some stage they will just go full social Darwinist on your ass. And they'll say that because they have a higher IQ and Jews have won a disproportionate amount of Nobel Prizes, that they somehow can make better use of the land. And that's kind of like stealing somebody's bicycle and telling them that you are now the rightful owner because you can ride it faster than they can. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now we're in 2024, And Khan's applied for arrest warrants. And he's going through the pre-trial chamber as well. It's probably going to go a lot quicker this time around. He's probably doing that to cover his bases. Unfortunately for justice, he's starting the clock from October 7, 2023, leaving a whole damn buttload of justice richly deserved on the table, but at least it's a start. Either way, it looks like the Israel project is coming to an end. Between the ICJ and the ICC, global protests and demands for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, combined with the rapid decline of the US and the emergence of a multipolar world, our Epstein Island visiting elite can cry and scream as much as they want, and it's not going to do a damn thing. Let's hope we get front row seats when the Israeli government gets their justice. Now, you consider yourself briefed for now. Click the subscription button to stay informed on what's going on, and I'll see you later. Justice for Palestine.